So recently I was a guest speaker at the inaugural Canadian Whisky Symposium. I thought I would share my presentation with you all on this channel as well. So I hope you enjoy it and let's get to it. If you're interested in learning more about the science of distillation in the beverage industry, be sure to check out my new course, which is available now. Okay, hello. So a little bit about me. My name's Christine, and you may know me as Miss Brewbird from my YouTube channel. So in 2019, I earned a diploma in brewing and brewery operations from Kwantlen Polytechnic University. So my background is in beer originally. And then when I was about to graduate, I became very interested in the distilling process because it seemed like a natural extension to brewing beer. And I'd always wanted to do a working holiday abroad. So I decided to just email a bunch of distilleries in the UK and see if I could go and work there. And eventually I heard back from the Borders Distillery in Scotland. And so I went there. And along the way, I worked at other distilleries in the UK for about 2 years. And during that time, I started a YouTube channel to kind of document my adventures as a distiller in the UK. And then in 2022, I earned my IBD diploma in distilling as well. So that's a bit about me. Okay, so let's go over what we're going to discuss in this presentation. We're going to talk about what congeners are. Then we're going to have an overview of the fermentation process. Then we're going to discuss fermentation-derived congeners and how those congeners can be controlled through the fermentation. Then we'll have an overview of the distillation process and how the distillation process can be used to control the concentration of congeners that are in our final spirit. And then we're going to taste for congeners, or at least in the Whisky Symposium, I had spiked a bunch of beer samples for everyone to taste, like off flavors that you find in your wash as it's fermenting. I wanted to preface this presentation by first saying that my background is initially in the brewing industry. So when I think about whiskey, I think of it as an extension of beer and the brewing process. So when I think of whiskey congeners, I think of beer off flavors. And so a lot of the flavors that we're going to talk about and focus on today are also beer off flavors. So it's kind of a 2-in-1 presentation today. So what are congeners? Congeners are minor compounds other than alcohol, ethanol, that are produced during the fermentation and maturation processes. How you ferment something and how you distill it and mature it will determine the level of congeners that are present in the final spirit. And so these congeners are very, very important to us because they contribute to the taste and aroma of whiskey. Okay, so here's a fun fact. Did you know that congeners may induce more severe hangovers? So hangovers are mainly caused by ethanol, but congeners can contribute to may contribute to how severe those hangovers are. And usually higher congener beverages are beverages that have color, like bourbon or rum, aged rum. So those colored spirits with high congener levels may cause more severe hangovers than lower congener beverage, which are usually clear like vodka. Okay, so let's go through fermentation. We start with our malted barley in beer and a lot of whiskeys, and we will pass that through the mill to grind it up and expose the starches that are inside the malted barley. And then we'll mash it, which is when we mix it and we add hot water to it. And during this process, the starches that are inside the malted barley will be converted by enzymes that are present in the malted barley into fermentable sugars. So these starches get converted into fermentable sugars, and then we will siphon off the liquid component of the mash, and that will be our sugary rich liquid, which we call the wort. And it will have all the fermentable sugars in it. And we're going to add yeast to the wort, and the yeast is what carries out the ethanol fermentation. So it eats up these fermentable sugars and it produces the ethanol. It also produces a lot of CO2, and some byproducts from this fermentation process are the congeners, which are minor compounds that contribute to the flavor of our whiskey. Okay, so again, fermentation is a biological process where sugars such as glucose, fructose, and sucrose are converted into ethanol and carbon dioxide. So some fermentation congeners include higher alcohols, esters, acids, aldehydes, ketones, and sulfur compounds, which we'll discuss later on in this presentation. So who can tell me what compound this chemical formula stands for? It is ethanol, which nobody in the audience for the Whisky Symposium was able to get correct, which is pretty funny because we all spend so much time making alcohol, but yet we can't recognize the chemical formula for it. You can see in ethanol, there's 2 carbons in ethanol. And higher alcohols will have more than 2 carbons in the chemical formula. And higher alcohols, also known as fusel alcohols, are produced through chemical reactions with carbohydrates and amino acids. So usually with more abundant yeast growth, we'll see more higher alcohols. And again, generally, when we're running a fermentation very fast and hot, we will produce more congeners than if we were to run a very cold and slow fermentation. Then we'd see fewer congeners being formed, generally. So again, more fusel alcohols are formed when fermentation occurs at higher temperatures, usually at lower pH, and when a yeast nutrient is added. And you can see I put an asterisk in front of all of these things. That's because it's very hard to get a clear answer on like what will cause certain congeners to increase or decrease in the fermentation. So studying this is very popular in brewing, in beer making, because we're very interested in the fermentation. If we increase the temperature by 1 or 2 degrees, like how does that affect the fermentation and the flavors that we're getting from the beer? So this is studied a lot in beer making. And I remember one time in brewing school, we were speaking about a certain flavor compound. And in one lecture, the teacher said, okay, this chemical compound will increase with temperature when the temperature increases. And then we went into another lecture with a different teacher, and she said, okay, this chemical compound will decrease when the temperature increases. So they were saying completely the opposite thing. When we pointed this out to them, all the teachers went into a room by themselves and they discussed it at length, and they came back and said, okay, well, we've decided to agree to disagree. And so, yes, it's very hard to get a definitive answer on this sometimes. And so a higher alcohol that we see a lot of is isoamyl alcohol, which has a really fruity, pleasant smell at low levels. And then at higher levels, it can be a bit like nail polish or varnish, and it can be really unpleasant. Okay, next we're moving on to esters. So esters are the largest group of aroma compounds, and they impart very fruity and flower-like aromas to our whiskeys. Ethyl acetate is the most abundant type of ester. And again, at low levels, nice and fruity. At higher levels, very solvent-like. And esters are really what we think about when we think of all the different nuances in aroma and flavor in whiskeys. So here's just an example of some. We have ethyl caproate, which has apple aniseed notes, ethyl caprate, which has sweet, waxy, and fruity notes. We have beta phenylethyl acetate, which has notes of roses and honey, and we have isoamyl acetate, which has banana or apple notes to it. And if anyone here has ever had a German Hefeweizen beer, then they'll have tasted isoamyl acetate, because the Belgian yeast strains that are used to make this type of beer, they produce a lot of isoamyl acetate, which is one of the main notes in that type of beer. Next, we have sulfur compounds, which I'm sure every distiller is familiar with. So sulfur compounds have an extremely low odor threshold. So that means when it's there in just a very small amount, you can usually still smell it, and that smell is not nice. It has a rotten egg aroma. Luckily, a lot of it is purged by CO2 evolution during fermentation. And what I mean by CO2 evolution is when you think of a fermentation vessel, CO2 is being produced, as well as ethanol or alcohol. The CO2, it's rising up from the fermentation vessel, and as it's rising up, it's also carrying away a lot of that hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg aroma that we don't want. Another thing I've noticed as a distiller is because hydrogen sulfide, it's so volatile, it will easily dissipate into the air. So sometimes when I've done a distillation, and if it really smells like hydrogen sulfide, I'll just keep the tank of spirit out and uncovered, and it will naturally dissipate into the air. And when you come back the next day, it'll be almost completely gone. So carbonyl compounds are produced by the yeast cells as they grow, but they'll also be removed and taken up again by the yeast during the fermentation log phase. So even though the yeast produces it, it will also remove it later on in the fermentation process. And some carbonyl compounds are acetaldehyde, which at low levels is kind of a green apple aroma to it. At high levels, it really smells like nail polish. And then we have furfural, which has a burnt almond aroma to it. Another important carbonyl compound is diacetyl, which is actually one of my favorite off flavors, and it has a nice slick mouth feel to it. It can be really pleasant in small amounts, but it's considered a defect in large amounts. And in brewing, you can remove diacetyl by performing a diacetyl rest. So you increase the temperature by a few degrees, and then you hold it at that temperature to allow the yeast to naturally remove the diacetyl again. So some fun facts about diacetyl: it's added to butter as a preservative. Diacetyl also used to be added to microwavable popcorn packages, but they stopped doing that around 2007 when research showed that consuming a lot of diacetyl can contribute to lung disease or lung problems. Next is acids and phenols. So an example of an acid is acetic acid, which gives vinegar. It's very pungent and sour taste. We have isovaleric acid, which you see more so in beer, and that's from old hops, and it gives off cheesy aromas. We also have phenols, which occur in minor amounts and usually originate from the raw materials themselves. So, phenols within the peat smoke are responsible for the smoky aromas that you find in peated whiskeys. I'm recording this presentation on Canva, and my head bubble, it's fixed right on the left side, bottom left side of the screen. And I know it's covering some of the words, but I'm going to link the presentation down below in the description. So if you want to download the presentation, you can as well. Okay, so let's continue with controlling fermentation-derived congeners. So there's several factors that will influence congener production in whiskey fermentations. These include the yeast strain, the condition of the yeast, how the yeast are growing. So for yeast strain and condition, these are a lot of these factors are very important, more so for brewers than they are for distillers. From my experience, distillers, they don't care too much about the yeast, especially when compared to brewers. Distillers, they just buy some distilling yeast that can withhold a very high ABV and very high osmotic pressure, and that can distill as much alcohol as possible. That's what distillers are interested in. Whereas for brewers, they love yeast. They love talking about yeast and how using different yeasts will give off different flavors. Like, for example, before I mentioned the Hefeweizen beer, where you're getting these Belgian yeast strains that produce a lot of isoamyl acetate, which gives really nice banana notes to a beer. And then in the next slide, so yes, again, temperature is very important in controlling fermentation. If we increase the temperature by just 1 or 2 degrees, that's very important for brewers. For a lot of distillers, their fermentation vessels or washbacks will not be temperature regulated. So this factor isn't very well controlled in distilleries. And the reason that distilleries often don't have temperature controlled fermentation vessels is because they're very expensive to buy and it doesn't necessarily make a huge difference for distilling products. For distillers, we really like to focus on how we can control the distillation process. If we're putting it in barrels, the maturation process. Those are mainly the 2 factors that we're very interested in controlling. Okay, so now moving on to distillation. So a quick overview of what distillation is. It's the process of separating the components or substances of a liquid mixture by using selective boiling and condensation, usually inside an apparatus known as a still. So how we use this selective boiling and condensation is by knowing the relative volatilities of the congeners inside the liquid mixture. So understanding volatility is very, very important to understanding the distillation process. Different relative volatilities of congeners allow them to reach very high concentrations in specific areas of the still. Okay, so let's talk more about congener volatilities. Volatility is related to a congener's boiling point and also the concentration of ethanol in the still. And so what I mean by that is when we're starting a distillation, let's say we have a pot still, the wash that we put inside the pot, it has ethanol, which is the main thing we're after. It has water, and it also has these congeners. So these congeners, they don't all have the same boiling point. For instance, we know that ethanol, it has a boiling point of about 78 degrees Celsius, but these other flavor compounds inside the mixture have different boiling points. We know, for example, that methanol has a boiling point about 65 degrees Celsius. So that's why as the distillation begins, the temperature, it starts low and then it gets higher and higher and higher. As we start heating the still up, we'll get to 65 degrees Celsius and we'll start collecting that methanol, acetaldehyde, which have lower boiling points. And that's what we're collecting in the foreshots and in the heads. These not so nice flavors that have a lower boiling point. And when they have a lower boiling point, usually they're high volatility compounds. So it's a bit of a reverse there. If it's high volatility, it means it has a lower boiling point because it vaporizes easier inside the still. So this is how we use our understanding of volatility to separate out different flavor compounds throughout the distillation and essentially control the level of congeners in our final product. So again, when we're making those heads, hearts, and tails cuts, this is what we're doing. Okay. So yes, again, higher volatility compounds will move up the still and be collected in the heads. Lower volatility compounds will concentrate where the ethanol level is low at the base of the still or in the tails component. We know that fusel oil is more volatile in low ethanol, high water concentrations. So this is coming at the end of the distillation because as the distillation continues, there's less and less alcohol inside the pot of the still because it's continually being distilled out and we're collecting it on the other side. So the ratio of ethanol to water will continue to get lower and lower and lower. And that mixture will have a higher amount of water in it compared to ethanol when we're nearing the end of the distillation. Congeners can be controlled by distillation through copper contact, which is very well documented and which is why distillers love copper so much. And actually, I made a video just about copper and why distillers love it, using it so much. And I'll link that to the top of this video. We can also control congeners through the changing ethanol and water concentrations throughout the distillation duration, and the temperature. If we're running the distillation very hot and fast, we're collecting more of these flavor compounds in our distillate. Whereas if we run it very slowly at colder temperatures, we are getting a nicer, cleaner, smoother spirit at the end. And also, of course, we can control congeners during distillation by taking cuts. And when taking cuts, we have our foreshots, our heads, which is where we get rid of the less pleasant flavors that have a lower boiling point. And then when the flavor starts tasting a bit nicer, we'll collect our hearts. And then we have our tails at the end. And a lot of times we will redistill the heads and the tails because we don't want to waste all that good ethanol that we've worked so hard to create. And so, depending on what you're making, you may want to collect deeper into the tails part. So you're getting a rougher tasting spirit, but maybe that's okay because you'll put that spirit into casks and allow it to mature. And as we know, inside the casks, the spirit will interact with the wood, will interact with the char layer inside of the cask. And these reactions can help take away some of those negative flavors, add new flavors to the spirit, which is all part of the maturation process. Okay, so did you know that congener variety and concentration can be used to authenticate whiskey? So in 2016, the European Union Intellectual Property Office estimated the spirits and wine industry's losses were about 1.3 billion annually due to counterfeit products in the EU marketplace, with some reports suggesting that as much as a third of commercial Scotch whiskies tested were fraudulent. With some bottles of Scotch whiskey selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars or even into the millions of dollars. There's a lot of fraudsters out there that want to make a quick buck by selling fake whiskey. Researchers are continually coming up with new methods to combat this whiskey fraud, and one of the ways they do this is by using gas chromatography. And using this method, they can come up with basically a fingerprint for that specific whiskey, and they'll be able to see the different levels, concentrations of congeners that are present in that whiskey, making this unique fingerprint of that particular whiskey. So they'll do this with authentic whiskey. And then when they have a bottle of whiskey that they're not sure what it is, they can test it, come up with its own unique fingerprint. It can compare it with what they know to be authentic whiskey to determine whether the sample that they have is authentic or fake. Maturation congeners. So this topic fell outside the scope of my presentation, which focused mainly on fermentation and distillation. However, maturation plays a very important role in congeners and spirits as well. So phenols, aromatic aldehydes, lactones, and terpenes are all derived from wood that's used to make casks. And the levels of these congeners are affected by the wood species, how the wood is seasoned, how the cask is built, and also how many times that cask has been used. Is it a virgin cask, first fill cask? All of these will impact the level of congeners that are imparted from the wood into the spirit. For example, things like tannins and polyphenol compounds will contribute to that astringent taste that you find in whiskey. I also wanted to say that for maturation congeners, I did do a video about that, which I think is pretty good. So if you want to learn more about that, be sure to check out that video, which I've linked above. And during my presentation, I did have spiked beer samples that had contamination, which had a sour and buttery taste from the diacetyl and acetic acid. We had DMS, which had cooked corn and creamed corn or cooked vegetable taste. We tried diacetyl, which is actually a very nice taste, which I love. It has that lovely, slick mouthfeel, and it's got a bit of a buttery taste to it. We also tried hydrogen disulfide spiked in the beer. At the end of the presentation, I also gave everyone some spiked beer with trans-2-nonanol, which is an aldehyde that forms from oxidation of the beer or the wash. And it basically tastes just like wet cardboard. Like, imagine drinking wet cardboard, and that's the taste of trans-2-nonanol. Okay, I hope you enjoyed watching my presentation on whiskey congeners / beer off flavors at the Canadian Whisky Symposium. Please support this channel by giving this video a thumbs up and leaving a comment down below. Also, hit that subscribe button for more videos about distilling, brewing, and drinks. This is Brewbird, sending good vibes your way. I'll see you next time!